So I will start this one with a disclaimer. The disclaimer being that for the purpose of giving this presentation, I am David Bernhold, because he's the one who put together these slides. He's the one who did all of the research. He's on vacation, so he's not available to give these slides to you. So I'll try to answer easy questions. Try not to ask me hard questions. If you do, I will defer them until David is back from vacation and you can get your answers then. So software licensing. If you have a code that you're developing, it's resident on GitHub as an open source repository, you should consider certain of the implications of doing that. And one of them, the important one among them is licensing. How do you want to license it? Because if you don't think about it and your code is available, it can happen that sometimes you lose control of your own code. It has been known to happen, for example, in one particular code written by University of Wisconsin where they did not assert copyright. It was publicly available. A company picked out their code, acquired a commercial license for it, and the developers of the code had to pay in order to use their own code. So make sure that that doesn't happen to you. So copyright and software licensing. Copyright grants the creator of the work exclusive rights to its use and distribution. In some sense, you do not have to assert a copyright. Just by creation, you have acquired the copyright to that content. So rights in software that are of interest are the rights for reproduction and distribution and the right to the derivative work. So licenses are what is used to transfer rights from one party to another. Under the US law, software you write is subject to copyright on creation. So you don't have to do anything to claim the right. That copyright owner may be, though not you, but your employer, if your contract has the terms that any intellectual property created by the employee is owned by the employer, then the copyright resides with your employer. There is an exception to this, in that the work created by US government cannot be copyrighted. They're considered to be in public domain. And the reason for this is not any altruistic reason. The reason for this is to prevent the possibility that laws that are created in the public domain can be copyrighted by someone and therefore not be available for public consumption. So this is to prevent any such possibility of information of public interest becoming copyrighted and therefore not for ready use by people. The licensing spectrum is huge. So you have things from proprietary or closed licenses which will say all rights are reserved, in which case, except in the form that the license says you can use that product, you cannot use it in any way, to completely free and open licenses that are in public domain and completely open and you can do anything or any with them. Then there is the free versus open source. So free is the freedom to do, in the license is freedom to do certain things with the software. And that is not just that the software is available without any cost. That's not what freedom here means. Free means that you have certain things that you can do with the software and you're free to do so. So there is the Free Software Foundation and there is an open source initiative which is where, which basically handle these are the things that handle issues related to free and open software. So for the free software also, some people, open source is another term used. So there are four freedoms that are associated with free software. That is the freedom to run the program for any purpose. So if the software is open source and you take it, you can run it for any purpose that you want to. There is no restriction on what you can use it to run on or run for not. You have the freedom to study how the program works, which means that you can inspect the source code in any way you like. and you can change it and customize it for your own purposes. So, and of course, a precondition for that is the access to the source code. You have the right to redistribute the code, which means that you can download it and you can give it to someone further. And you also have the freedom to distribute the copies of your modified versions, which means the derived code you are also free to distribute to whoever you want to. Again, access to the source code is a precondition for this. And the open source initiative has a definition which amounts to the same thing. That is free software. Permissive and copyleft software are not entirely free. Permissive software is similar to free. So permissive is where licensee can distribute the derivative work as they like. The relicensing of the derivative works is also permitted. And that also includes proprietary licenses. So some of the examples are Apache, MIT, and BSD licenses. And the derived works there is no requirement that the derived works are distributed and relicensed. They may be held private and never released at all. Copyleft is more restrictive in that the licensee must distribute derivative work as open software. So in that sense, it's restrictive or viral. Now, why is this viral? Viral is that if any derivative work from that is automatically infected with the same copyright, with the same license features that the original work had. And some of the examples of this are GPL, which is GNU Public License, or LGPL, which is the library GNU Public License. This is the major reason why, if you recently bought an Apple platform, that Xcode will no longer get the GNU, will no longer work with the GNU software. It's because of these licensing issues, because then Xcode becomes infected with GPL, and therefore Apple has stayed away from all of that legality. So what is a derivative work? It is a work that is derived from a major copyright protected elements from a previously created first work. This is the definition as given by Wikipedia. But essentially it boils down to is you are basically taking somebody else's software and modifying it for your own use or for some other purpose. But then that raises the question is what happens when you're linking it to a library, whether you're doing it statically or dynamically, because in some sense you're modifying the binary that comes out from that particular software. Or if you're interacting via pipes and you're using a component as a library as a component in the I can't speak. If you're using the library as a component in a multiphysics application. And this is an ongoing debate. GPL considers everything, including a library linked, as a derived software, and therefore with the viral label. LGPL is specifically created for libraries. So here, if you're linking to a library, is not considered derived work. So that's why there are two different flavors of those licenses. And this distinction does not matter for permissive licenses very much, because there are no restrictions on what kind of, if you're doing relicensing, there is no restriction on what kind of relicensing it needs to be. But then, if you are a user who has taken a look at several different libraries that together are useful for you to create your application, now you have a problem if you have licenses that are different and incompatible with one another. So that's why this has been a cause of major discussion. So this is taken from a real world example. Please read the statements here and tell me whether this is a open source license or not. Is this an open source license? And what makes you say that this is not an open source license?
I feel like the first one.
Right.
Without modification.
Yes, exactly. They are not, so it's a fairly restrictive license. It is that you are given the source code. So this doesn't say that you're not given the source code. You're given the source code and you're allowed to build it, but you are not allowed to modify it without notifying the authors, without the approval of the authors. And this was a code released by one of the national labs. And there is a reason why they have this kind of a restrictive license is because they had this very bad experience that someone took their code, modified it, made it wrong, ran, got results, published them, and they got blamed because this person did not specify that he or she had modified the software. So that's why they instituted this restrictive license. And then we'll come back to this later, I think. But then the question is, when you as a developer of a software are set to release a software, how should you choose a license? What are the considerations that you want to take into account for choosing a license? What are the kinds of rights that you want to retain or grant? Who can use the program? Do you want people to be able to use it and modify it in any way they like? Do you want the users to be able to see the source code? Do you want them to be able to modify the source code? Can they redistribute the modified or the unmodified code? Or can the modified code be relicensed? So you, as a distributor of the code, have to go through these steps and think about whether you want, which of these are acceptable to you. The other ones that are less personal, but you still have to consider are what kind of compatibility that it has with other software under licenses, because in general, a permissive license will create less issue for your users. So if you want to have a large user base, it is in your interest to have licenses that are more permissive. And then you have to, how do you want the labeling of derived works, whether you want the derived work to be labeled differently from the original work, or you want it to be fed back into the original work. How do you basically want to do this? And then there is this issue of patent grant and retaliation, which is there in some of the later slides. But whatever you do, don't devise your own license, because there are already 80 plus existing licenses, and one or the other is sure to meet your requirements for whatever degree of permissiveness you want to have in your distribution. So more popular OSI approved licenses are, and their characteristics. So Apache is permissive. It's GPL compatible in version 3, but not version 2. Whether it does patent grant, yes. And I'm sorry, I forgot exactly what patent grant was. So I will tell you after this lecture is over. I don't need to read this out. You have the slides you can read. You have a table for what various kinds of licenses are and what degree of permissiveness and compatibility they do. And then these are the software business models, whether you want to sell the software, whether you want to do. So there is a difference between selling the software and selling to commercial users, because some of the software developers allow academic institutions to use the software for free, but do not want the software to be free to commercial entities, and therefore they have dual licensing where the academic license is different from commercial license. And then whether you are, so if you take an open source, can you relicense a derived work to proprietary? What's the convenience for packaging? And then there are some licenses that, just take the free open source software and then package it and then use that for self-convenience, professional services around the software, etc. And custom development service, software as a service, or sometimes people may want to sell the research and not the software license. So, not the software. So all of these considerations have to be, are in the process of choosing a license. Then there is the consideration that you may not want someone else to financially benefit from your open source software, because you can, if you have a permissive license, that will prevent others from taking a derivative proprietary license that they can sell, that will allow them to sell the derived software. Then if you have a copyleft license, that will prevent that. But then if you do want a commercial entity to use your software, then what is the consideration? Because copyleft is scary to many commercial entities, like the example of Apple that I gave with GPL is precisely because it infects all of the derivative software, so they don't want to have anything to do with it. So if you do want a commercial entity to use your software, then you want to make sure that you haven't used a copyleft licensing. Then there is the question of protecting my intellectual property, and this came up earlier also in my previous talk about community codes and people wanting to protect, is that some people wrongly think that they need to hide their software because otherwise people will scoop you. And if you're that insecure about ability to generate ideas, then you're probably in the wrong field. Again, that's just my opinion. Open source licenses do not require that the derived works are made public, but if you do, then you have to make the source available. So, if you want a compromise, if you want an open source software, but if you want to not make it available immediately, if you want to derive some benefit out of, see, because you as a software developer, say, just invested 2 years of your life into developing this software, you may not immediately want that to be available to everyone because you want to derive benefit from having invested that amount of time and get some head start from your competitors. So there is a, you should not then do a public release until you have exploited your software up until the time that you have derived some benefit from it. And then why would you prefer open sources? Because because managing the paperwork with proprietary license is terrible. And I learned that through bitter experience. So Flash is in some sense open source, but not really. Because the original, at the time of original release, a custom semi-proprietary license was put in place because DOE was concerned about open distribution of the software, which was considered too useful to be readily available to citizens of sensitive countries. So DOE wanted us to keep track of people who were asking for the software and deny the software to certain group of people. And there was no such license that would allow us to do that, so we made a custom license there. It still exists because no one will give us permission to get rid of that license, even though now other countries have gone ahead and developed similar capabilities and they're readily available as open source. So our license is like completely redundant, any restriction we might place on it. But the bigger problem that happened was, at one point, IBM wanted to use our code to test their licenses, to test their compilers. And because this was a sort of semi-proprietary license, lawyers from both the University of Chicago is where Flash resides. The lawyers from both the University of Chicago and IBM got involved. IBM still hasn't got Flash for use in its compiler testing because this was their Canada branch and not their US branch. So some totally unexpected things can happen if you haven't given enough thought to how you want this to be handled. But some other related matters related to copyright and licensing is that it is a good practice to assert copyright and make license terms explicit right from the beginning. You should do this in every file, otherwise you have no way of ensuring that your copyright and your licenses are followed. I mean, it's a debatable question whether you should do it in every file or in every module, and there are advantages and disadvantages to each because if you have a coding convention where you don't let more than one function reside in a file, then your code base will explode by having the license copyright in every code, et cetera, But the thing is to do both. Best practice, use intelligence and creativity and trade-offs and figure out what is the sweet spot for you and do it that way. And this is a good place to see detailed discussion of maintaining copyright with free software. And then, as I pointed out in the earlier talk also, you have to think about how you're going to do code contribution acceptance, because most of the code contributions are implicitly offered under current license, and all authors have a copyright interest in the code. So if you have a license where you want to change the license later, all of the contributors have to agree. And I believe Trillinos has had an issue where they were under GPL or were under some other and wanted to switch to GPL, and one particular contributor would not agree to changing the license, and therefore they had to do a workaround and basically jump through the hoops in order to to relicense the code. So it's good to clarify and make explicit the terms of contribution, make the contributor aware of it, obtain additional rights, ensure clear title to make the contribution, et cetera, and when you do that, make sure that you have checked with your organization, because many of us have fallen into this error of not checking with the legal department and getting into trouble later, because you know, there's potential to have benefit to your institution from the release of such codes. And then this is a related issue, but this is not software, is that if you have some other intellectual property that you want to make available analogous to open source, then Creative Commons is the most common license, and it has similar variants, et cetera, and then there is this this public domain dedication indicates intent to place artifact in the public domain, but it doesn't satisfy legal requirements in all jurisdiction. And I will repeat at this point, David's non-disclaimer about everything else is that neither he nor I am a legal expert, so don't take this as legal advice. If you do anything that you think will require some legal advice, go talk to the lawyers in your institution and your organization. But these are just generally things to be aware of as you write software and as you think about releasing it openly. Some other resources are listed here, and you will have them in the list of in the slides that are available. And that's the end of this talk. Questions?
Where do you put the license? Like in every file, or just a separate file? Or just the name?
It's an open question, and I think it is pretty much up to the developer. Very often also, if you don't have a, what some software developers do, for example, what Flash does is it requires you to sign an agreement before the code is available to you. But you, of course, can't do that for an open source software. But say, giving access to people to your repository, you may have a requirement to first sign the licensing agreement, and then you release the software to them. Or if you want people to be able to download it completely for free, then you have to consider where you want it and how often do you want to repeat it. Any other question? Yes?
So I don't understand that first case you said with the Wisconsin group, that company that took their software.
So they didn't put any sort of copyright.
They just said nothing.
The point is that, strictly speaking, they would have won the legal case if they had fought it, because there's copyright on creation. But that would have required long, drawn-out legal case, et cetera, and so.
But they were
technical, yeah. And I think eventually they did an out-of-court settlement in the sense that the company said, yeah, sure, you can use it. But I mean, one exaggerates a little bit also to make the point. Yes?
So can I just put one line, like an IP license or GPL license?
I think you have to, I can't give you the specific answer, and if there's someone more knowledgeable in the audience, say so, but I think you have to register it, that this is the license.
More questions.
Oh, okay.
A lot of the codes just put like a section of the GPL right at the top of each source file, and if you go to the site, it tells you what to put there.
Yeah.
Like about a paragraph. I have to call
Paragraph.
Yeah, just like in the comments at the top. While using the source code. If you're using that license.
Yeah, oh, I guess, so speaking to, about the Wisconsin thing, so if you start writing a code and you're putting it, let's say for like public on GitHub, should you put like copyright, all rights reserved before you go through and make any other decisions at first? Or?
If you don't want to be tripped by a similar situation, yes, you should. Or it may not be so easy to do now that there is, so this is also many, many years ago, where things like GitHub and were not around, and so even if people were doing even if people had repositories, they were not publicly open repositories. So that may have changed. All right, I can understand that, I am tired. I started today. You guys started, what, 10 days ago? I can totally understand that you're too exhausted to even think and ask questions. But if you think of questions later, even after going back home and decompressing from this, you have questions, feel free to email them to any of us who have given the lectures today.